Right here at 4 o'clock, one of the 3 officers who failed to turn on their body camera during the Scotty Scheffler arrest has now been charged with theft in an unrelated case. According to court documents, it happened during an arrest earlier this month. LMPD officer Javar Downs is accused of taking thousands of dollars from a person he was arresting. Other officers report seeing footage that show him taking $4,000. He was placed on emergency suspension, and the chief of police has started the firing process.
You just watched a frustrated East Canton police officer suddenly resign. It happened this past Monday in front of City Council. It's a decision Andrea Mixon didn't make lightly.
Filling in for the shifts that we don't have covered and the low pay. I mean, I was only working for $20 an hour in that area.
Mixon says one of the key things that played a major factor in her decision to resign is how she was treated after she was shot at during a police chase back in June.
People tend to think that East Canton's this Mayberry area. You know, it's a small village. Nothing ever happens there. And that's the number one concern for me is these small towns that they believe that nothing is going to happen. And it's just when it's going to happen.
According to Mixon, she continued to work her shift minutes after being shot at. She worked until 12 p.m. the next day and says the department never offered her time off.
When you particularly think about critical incidences of those natures, majority of departments do have a process after the fact. You know, if it's an officer-involved shooting or if it's something that is very critical, you have a debriefing. You talk about it with your higher-ups. Sometimes they send a chaplain in. But no, I was never offered those things.
Mixon says she would love to get back into law enforcement because it is a passion of hers.
In the courtroom to Mr. Martin accepting responsibility and pleading guilty.
Standing outside federal court, Emmett Martin stood alongside his attorneys, changing his tune about 2 weeks before his scheduled trial. The night of the encounter, Martin was the first to see Nichols. His attorneys say he was driven by anger.
Driven by fear. Fear of what he had done, fear of the consequences of the using that excessive force. Mr. Martin tried to cover it up.
Martin pleaded guilty to 2 of the 4 counts against him, excessive force and conspiracy to witness tamper. In exchange for the guilty plea, prosecutors recommending a sentence not to exceed 40 years while dropping the other 2 counts. However, the judge has the final say. Martin is the second former officer to change his plea behind Desmond Mills. The 3 other fired officers, Darius Bean, Demetrius Haley, and Justin Smith, retained their not guilty plea.
I do know that Martin and Haley were one of the main people that did the things to my son.
What responsibility does the city of Memphis bear?
Good morning and welcome to the Bad Apple Report. It's 7:30 a.m., bright and early right here at home on the range. Thank you so much for being here today, folks. You know, I really appreciate it. Isn't it a beautiful end of summer, you guys? It's absolutely beautiful here in Tennessee. And isn't it great to not be a bad apple? Whoa, these bad apples are going down hard. And it seems like every day, more and more bad apples. Well, okay. Well, just in case there's any good cops watching the Bad Apple Report, listen, you better stay being a good cop. Otherwise, we're going to feature you right here at home on the range, bright and early. That's right. For now, on with the show.
An arrest warrant is out for the former Okaloosa County Sheriff's deputy who pulled the trigger. Now facing a charge of manslaughter, he could face up to 30 years in prison if convicted.
Former Okaloosa County Sheriff's deputy Eddie Duran Jr. has been charged with manslaughter with a firearm. It happened on May 3rd at an apartment complex in Fort Walton Beach, only to be shot 5 times at point-blank range by Deputy Duran. Fortson's family says he was FaceTiming with his girlfriend. He was alone in his apartment at the time of the shooting.
The police just, we believe, use excessive force and execute him.
They have my word. If this shooting is found to be unjustified, their son's name will be fully vindicated and justice will be served.
Deputy Duran was fired in late May after an internal investigation, telling investigators he saw the gun and aggression in Fortson's eyes, adding Fortson made a slight step toward him, which he considered, quote, resistance. Fortson was buried 2 weeks after the shooting. Meanwhile, it was a separate criminal investigation by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement that issued the arrest warrant for manslaughter.
Beaten up during an arrest by a Spokane Valley police officer last year has filed a federal lawsuit saying his civil rights were violated.
And we're about to show you body camera footage from that night. We do want to warn you that it is graphic. Kevin Hinton was arrested because he was in a Spokane Valley park after dark. Hinton told Spokane Deputy Clay Hilton that he'd move his car and find another place to go, but Sergeant Hilton wouldn't let him go until he showed his ID. Hinton refused, and the situation escalated, and Hinton was pulled out of the car and struck several times by the sergeant. Hinton suffered several injuries, including several broken ribs, a concussion, and a punctured lung. More than a year later, Hinton is fighting for justice.
He shared his experience from that night with us for the first time in a one-on-one interview with Jordan Smith, who joins us in studio tonight with new details on this story. Jordan.
Yeah, Kevin Hinton, that violent arrest changed him forever. The 62-year-old was on his way home from Oregon after meeting his newly born granddaughter. He pulled into the parking lot of Terrace View Park to rest during his 12-hour road trip, a decision that led to a violent arrest where he thought he was going to die. How often do you think back to that night?
Every day. Every breath I take, kind of. I mean, and every time I lick my lips, I mean, it's just not going away.
Hinton says systemic failures led to his civil rights being violated that night.
You're under arrest. Get on the ground!
While in handcuffs, Hinton was evaluated by medics. They cleared him to be taken to the Spokane County Jail, not the hospital.
It was excruciatingly painful to get in and out of that police car. I literally thought I was dying. I mean, that was my thought at that point.
The jail refused to admit him, sending him straight to the emergency room. That's where Hinton learned several ribs had actually been separated from his sternum. His recovery process was agonizing.
Getting up to go to the bathroom was a challenge.
Spokane police investigated the incident and recommended second-degree assault charges against Sergeant Hilton. It was then sent to the Yakima County prosecutor for review, and 6 months later, no charges had been recommended from their office.
If that would have been you or I would have been in jail that night and still in jail. You know, he should have been relieved of duty immediately and dealt with accordingly.
Hinton has filed a federal lawsuit saying there are systemic failures in the sheriff's office and the county when it comes to keeping citizens safe. The lawsuit also claims that Sergeant Hinton was actually involved in a previous excessive force complaint 3 months prior to this incident, a case where Judge George Fearing wrote this about Sergeant Hilton, suggesting, quote, he works as a law enforcement officer not to serve others and benefit the Spokane community, but to intimidate and dominate.
It's time for some justice in this.
The Spokane County Sheriff's Office did not return our request for comment on this. Meanwhile, the Yakima County prosecutor told us they'd provide an update on where they're at this process in terms of getting charges out by lunchtime. We reached out again and never heard back. So a lot of moving pieces in this lawsuit.
A developing story, a Broken Arrow firefighter is on administrative leave after he was arrested, accused of pointing a gun at someone while on Keystone Lake in Pawnee County. That firefighter is also a former reserve deputy with the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office. Fox 23's Kaylee Carnine talked to the Pawnee County Sheriff about the arrest.
You're supposed to hold yourself to a higher standard, and that is definitely not it.
Justin Williams, the firefighter accused of pointing a gun at a man, fights fires in Broken Arrow. Pawnee County Sheriff Darren Varnell says he was at Keystone Lake fighting with people doing donuts on their ATVs.
Apparently, some individuals on ATVs were out playing in the sand. Gentleman had docked his boat there, from what I understand, at the edge of the water. They slung sand on the boat. Tempers flared. Next thing we know, it's being reported that there's now been a gunfight.
Williams' son, who Chief Varnell believes is a teenager, gave his dad the gun.
His son was on the boat and handed the gun to him, and then starts holding his badge up, screaming, "My dad's a cop."
Court documents show those people on ATVs called deputies who arrested Williams on a misdemeanor count of reckless conduct with a firearm. We reached out to the Broken Arrow Fire Department, which released this statement. Broken Arrow Fire Department is aware of an off-duty firefighter who was involved in an encounter outside Broken Arrow city limits. It went on to say that the employee is put on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Williams was also a reserve deputy with the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office. I reached out to their office and they gave me this statement. statement. Justin Williams passed all the required background checks and was a member of the Broken Arrow Fire Department when he became a member of TCSO's Reserve Deputy Program on January 2nd, 2024. On July 30th, 2024, the Pawnee County Sheriff's Office notified us that Williams was involved in an altercation in their jurisdiction and that criminal charges were possible. Williams was suspended from the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office Reserve Program that same day. Once Williams was criminally charged, he was terminated as a TCSO Reserve Deputy. Covering news that matters, Kaylee Carnine, Fox 23 News.
Major arrest in the Jamie Knoll investigation of a man who reportedly calls him a close friend. Clarksville police officer and Clark County Councilman John Miller seen in the passenger seat of this cruiser taken to Clark County Jail by Indiana State Police. Wearing a light blue suit jacket, Miller walked into the jail by troopers just after 2 Friday afternoon. ISP Captain Ron Galaviz talking to me over the phone moments after.
He turned himself in to the state police at the Sellersburg post.
This is Miller's mugshot. He's charged with official misconduct, a low-level felony. And late Friday afternoon, we're told Miller has since been transported over to Washington County, Indiana's jail. He's accused of funding New Chapel EMS as a councilman without revealing a conflict of interest. Investigators say Jamie Knoll paid for airfare, meals, and concert tickets for Miller using funds from the Utica Township Volunteer Firefighters Association, which of course Knoll ran. The probable cause affidavit lists an interview with police where Miller described Knoll as a close friend.
Brittany Faree, a 45-year-old female.
ISP issuing a second arrest warrant Friday for former councilwoman Brittany Faree, who shares a child with Knoll. As of now, police are still searching for her.
And to this point, you guys don't have any knowledge of where Brittany Faree could be at this point?
Right, yeah, we're not exactly sure where she could possibly be at.
And I'm Janet Rose. Tonight, a former Windsor police officer is getting sued again for a violent traffic stop in 2020. You may remember body camera video captured a police officer pepper spraying Army Lieutenant Karan Nazario and threatening him multiple times.
And now Nazario's attorney says they are suing former police officer Joe Gutierrez for allegedly violating Nazario's Fourth Amendment rights. Emily Harrison is in studio breaking down this development.
And Emily, this is all because of a recent reversal by a circuit court judge.
Yes, and to be clear, the circuit court judge, Robert King, actually sided with the police officers a majority of the time in this opinion. This includes upholding immunities for both police officers like excessive force and First Amendment rights. But King reversed one key immunity, a Fourth Amendment claim for one specific police officer, and now the matter is going back to court.
Get out. Yeah, you should be.
Army Lieutenant Karan Nazario's attorneys called the first trial's outcome a, quote, miscarriage of justice after a jury awarded Nazario less than $4,000 in what was a $1 million lawsuit. But now, more than a year later, former Windsor police officer Joe Gutierrez is expected back in the courtroom following an immunity reversal.
Given Gutierrez's actions involving the firearms and the death threat to ride the Lightning, the Fourth Circuit determined that under those circumstances, he was not entitled to qualified immunity.
Jonathan Arthur, an attorney for Nazario, says they plan to sue Gutierrez for allegedly violating Nazario's Fourth Amendment rights. An appeal found that the officers did not have probable cause to find that Nazario purposefully eluded police despite not immediately pulling over. The judge then wrote, quote, Gutierrez's conduct combined with his death threats against Lieutenant Nazario was a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment that lies outside the protection of qualified immunity. Now Arthur wants to prove that to a jury and possibly set precedent.
One of the good things to have come out of the opinion from the circuit court is an opinion that can be used to strip officers of qualified immunity.
13 News Now reached out to Gutierrez's attorney about the new trial, but she declined to comment.
Now, to be clear, Arthur says this trial will only involve former police officer Gutierrez and not former police officer Daniel Crocker. This is going to be because it was Gutierrez who made those threats. Arthur says at this point they will ask for the damages in the original complaint once again. Emily Harrison, 13 News Now.
And a federal judge dismissed the charges against a Kansas man
who had a machine gun. The judge essentially said that the ban on machine guns is unconstitutional, saying prosecutors failed to clearly establish constitutional grounds for the ban. It's the first time a court has ruled this way since after a 2022 landmark decision from the Supreme Court. So to break this down, we have our chief legal analyst, Khalif Rhodes, with us. So in that 2022 Supreme Court ruling, the High Court said, quote, that restrictions need to be consistent with this nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. What does that mean?
You're talking about the Bruin decision, and this has a wide-reaching implications, but it means, do we have a history of wanting to ban this type of activity? Do we have a history of banning folks that are domestic violence, folks? Do we have a history of banning people that are convicted felons? Do we have a history, or in this case, of banning just machine guns? And so Justice Thomas doubled down on it, which is now saying that we have to have a history before you can ban something when you're talking about firearms. And if there is no history, and it really hasn't talked about the history, does the history need to be 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years, or does it need to be recent history? They haven't elaborated. But what it has done is cut out this new carve out for folks to say, well, some of the things that you're attempting to do that maybe we've done for the last 40 or 50 years aren't constitutional. There are a couple concerns that I have with this judge's opinion, specifically that I think there's a misstep in terms of the way he's approaching how and who implements the laws. Congress, for sure, they are the legislators. They write our laws. And so when you're talking about whether something is constitutional, they have constitutional authority to write the laws. Now, back when it was prohibition, they were attempting to, talk about who could get access to machine guns. And then in the 1860s, they did a complete ban on machine guns. But this wasn't an agency like the most recent cases where you talk about bump stops, where it was, agencies like the ATF doing these advisory opinions and these rulemaking authorities. And then the courts have said, you know what, you don't have authority to do that. This was actually done by Congress, which constitutionally they're allowed to do. So his argument to say that it's unconstitutional, I think, is problematic. The second portion is typically you wouldn't have a trial court judge making that determination. Normally what you'd have is a person be convicted, then they would appeal, and then on appeal, either on the federal appeal level or the Supreme Court would address it, and they say, hey, is this even constitutional? So I think this one obviously will be appealed. The state hasn't made a determination yet, but it seems like that judge in this moment has to follow what the Constitution or what our Congress has put as law. And so for me, there are a couple missteps with this comment.
Well, and the Justice Department is going to be the one that can appeal this. How does that process go after that?
I mean, they'll take it to the Court of Appeals. I mean, and the problem is the Supreme Court is ripe for listening and wanting to hear this type of case. Obviously, you have Thomas and folks that are following the Bruin decision wanting to actually get a case like this. I always talk about you want to have a case that has good facts, and you want to have a case that is right timing-wise with a good court. This case has great facts. It's a case that can move its way up through the Supreme Court. And so even if they win, they as in the Justice Department win on appeal, it goes to the Supreme Court, and it's a 50-50 toss because we do have a long storied history all the way back to Prohibition of banning machine guns. I'm just not sure if that's the history that they're looking for.
All right, well, we'll have to see what arguments they bring and if it does, in fact, reach it back to the High Court.
And that's a wrap, folks. Thank you so much again for being here this morning to watch the Bad Apple Report. And I'm going to do it. I'm going to go find some more bad apples just for you. And we'll see you right back here tomorrow morning at 7:30 a.m. bright and early. Have a great day, folks.